We're going to talk more about this now with our Middle East specialist, Stephen Cook. Stephen, welcome. We're just hearing from Hamas via an official statement that Palestinian factions have indeed rejected any talks about prisoner swaps until after Israel agrees to completely end its military offensive on Gaza, something Israel's rejected outright. Does that basically mean these talks in Cairo are dead in the water?
Well, never say never, but we do seem to be at an impasse here. The Israelis certainly believe that the military pressure that they're applying on Hamas is forcing, the collapse of Hamas and splits within the organization that might lead to the release of hostages. But so far, that calculation is inaccurate, and Hamas seems to be closing ranks and rejecting Israeli terms. So the fighting will continue, at least for the moment. The Egyptians will keep working at it, as will the Qataris. But right now, neither of the main parties, Israel or Hamas, seem terribly interested in a ceasefire.
Is that the biggest obstacle to these negotiations, or are there other factors at play as well?
Well, the Israelis have identified their strategic goal as the destruction of Hamas, and that is something that the Israeli public is demanding as well. So any kind of ceasefire that could turn into something more durable that would not render Hamas unable to threaten Israeli security would be seen as a strategic failure by the Israeli government and the Israeli people. So there is a lot of political pressure there to continue the fight. With Hamas, the military wing of Hamas in Gaza believes that they can still prevail in this fight and do not want to necessarily have a ceasefire that would once again turn into some sort of deal where Hamas would ultimately be sharing power with the Palestinian Authority, which is located in Ramallah. So once again, this conflict is not yet ripe for diplomacy to prevail and for there to be a ceasefire or any kind of durable ceasefire that would lead to a negotiated solution.
Well, I guess the bigger question is then how do we get to the point where it is ripe for diplomacy? I mean, just today, again, the armed wing of Hamas said it had launched new missiles toward Tel Aviv, this despite Israel's massive military campaign against Hamas in Gaza. What does this launch of these long-range missiles say about Hamas's military power in the face of everything coming from Israel?
Well, it's clear that Hamas has been well prepared for this fight over the course of a number of years. And as Israeli and Western media reports have revealed in recent days, there are deep and sophisticated tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip in which the Hamas is continuing to operate. For the Israelis, this is something that is untenable. So, as I said, they will continue the fight to do as much damage as they possibly can to Hamas, which would suggest that they'll have to get further and deeper into the tunnels rather than continuing to bombard Gaza with artillery or from the air.
And what about international pressure in all of this on both sides? What kind of effect is it having on the different parties?
Well, for the Israelis, they have defined this fight in existential terms. They see this as a fight for their survival. So international influence is unlikely to have a significant effect on it. The French government, the German government, the British government have all called for a durable ceasefire. That has done very, very little. President Biden has shifted his rhetoric about humanitarian aid and a ceasefire. That has done little to move the Israelis, who keep insisting that their goal is to the destruction of Hamas. For Hamas, the strategic goal is just to continue fighting in the face of this Israeli onslaught. As long as they remain standing and can fire missiles at Israel, it is a strategic victory for them. So that's why it's so difficult to get to the kind of hurting stalemate between the two parties, bloodied enough that would lead to diplomacy.
And in the meantime, of course, this is turning into a humanitarian disaster for all of the civilians who are in the Gaza Strip. These negotiations in Egypt, of course, come as the UN Security Council has delayed a vote on a new resolution that would try to get desperately needed aid into Gaza. This was delayed for a third time. What's the likelihood that the UN will finally get the language to a point where the U.S., obviously an ally of Israel, will not use its veto against the resolution?
Yeah, this is an extraordinarily difficult moment for the U.S. at the United Nations, because clearly the Biden administration is concerned about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, but it also understands Israel's strategic goals. Clearly, Hamas nor the Israelis have care too much about the civilian damage in the Gaza Strip, which leaves the United States, the UN Security Council, and the UN more broadly with very little that it can do. Even if this hard-fought resolution is passed, I'm skeptical that it's going to make much difference on the ground.
And in the meantime, I mean, the latest in Gaza is just awful. The World Health Organization just saying today northern Gaza has been left without a functional hospital due to lack of fuel, lack of staff, lack of supplies. How long can things really go on like this?
Well, as you point out, this is a humanitarian disaster, and international organizations are raising the alarm, and it is pushing people closer to the Egyptian border, which is putting a lot of pressure on the Egyptians. As far as the hospitals go, this was the inevitable result of Hamas using hospitals to shield themselves. And the Israelis fighting what they consider to be an existential fight. So it was almost inevitable that hospitals were going to be hit in the crossfire and, in fact, directly targeted. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is quite dire. And that does give some urgency to what's happening at the UN. But once again, even if more aid can come into the Gaza Strip, it is not going to fundamentally alter the military calculations on the ground, either for the IDF or Hamas.
Just to wrap up, Stephen, do you see a point where Hamas will be completely defeated as Israel wants? I mean, as one expert said, a defeat on the battlefield isn't always an ideological defeat.
Well, of course, you can't kill an ideology with bullets. I think that the Israelis believe that they can render Hamas unable to do the kinds of things that it did on October 7th. And certainly the Israelis are intent on hunting down the leadership, especially Yahya Sinwar, who was the mastermind of October 7th. So I don't believe that the Israelis will stop until they do more damage and until they have until they've killed those people who've been responsible for it and done more damage to Hamas's ability to fire missiles and arm cadres in the Gaza Strip.
All right, Stephen, thanks for taking the time to speak to us here on France 24. That's Stephen Cook.
Have a good day.